Good afternoon, and welcome to today's webinar, Thoughts on Composition, Student Ensembles. My name is Heather Meyer, and I will be running everything in the background for our session today. So let's get things started. I'm pleased to introduce today's presenter, Mike Collins-Dowden. Mike Collins-Dowden has taught 4th and 5th grade band at Pleasant Ridge School in Glenville, Illinois since 2007. He received his Bachelor in Music and Music Education and Trombone Performance from the Eastman School of Music in 2003. In 2007, he earned a Master's in Music Education from Temple University. Collins-Dowden has published more than 30 pieces with Alfred, FJH, and Jalen Music. For today's webinar, he'll be joined by fellow Alfred composers Chris Bernotas and Scott Watson. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Well, hi there. And let's see, Chris and Scott, I guess if you guys want to turn on your cameras and say hi, go ahead.
Hello.
Hey, everybody.
So today we're talking about composing for student ensembles. And the reason I wanted, all of us to get together is because one thing we have in common, in addition to being composers, is that all three of us have spent a significant amount of time teaching and composing for our own students. And I thought we could just share some ideas about, the ways that it has benefited not only our students, but also us, the teachers, what we've learned about composing from going through this process. So to start things off, I want to share just a little bit about, each of our experience composing for students and why we decided to do that. So I guess I'll go first. Like Heather said, I teach 4th and 5th grade band, and we're just finishing up our 16th school year now at my school. And I think the big reason why I started composing for my own students is just I was having a hard time finding repertoire that really fit the way I wanted to teach them, particularly. So the way I like to approach things is to start with, what are the skills that I want students to be learning, and then try to find repertoire that's going to support those skills. But particularly in like the second year of, our beginning band program, when I'm trying to teach my students to play in like the key of F major or play dotted quarter note rhythms, it can actually be like pretty hard to find pieces that have those things in them. And then you add on top of that the challenges of instrumentation. So maybe I have a really strong flute section, but my trumpets are a little weak, so that's going to rule out a lot of pieces. Or we don't start tuba players, so that kind of rules out a lot of pieces. So at a certain point, I would just kind of say, well, I'll just write something if I can't find something that fits the bill. So I would say when I started, I didn't even really consider it to be composing. I was more just kind of taking simple melodies and kind of arranging them. But I kind of along the way really surprised myself just by, even with those beginners who don't have a lot of skills, just how much you can learn about the compositional process from that. So that's kind of my experience. Chris, do you want to share a little bit about your experience?
So for those of you that don't know me, I spent 28 years in the classroom, 25 years at Mountain Lakes High School. And coincidentally, Scott and I are wearing Mountain Lakes colors, if you combine.
Is that right?
Yeah, blue and orange. And before I actually wrote concert band music, I actually wrote in college, because I think by nature, we're all very curious. I think any composer, teacher, we're curious by nature, and we want to know things. So I actually started writing original music in college because I had groups available to me, a trumpet ensemble, brass quintet, things like that. And then marching band arranging. Marching band arranging pretty much took over most of my writing for a lot of my teaching career, until there came a time when I was really thrilled because I was teaching my 9th graders about 5/8, 7/8, and these complex time signatures. I was feeling really good. I had great lessons prepared. The kids were really understanding this. And I did kind of what you said, Mike. I'm like, okay, they've got the skills. Let me give them a piece to play. And I had nothing. So I couldn't really find anything at that level. And I mentioned the marching band arrangement because this was in the time of year where it was a marching band drought. So I wasn't writing any marching band arrangements at that time. It was probably like December, and marching band directors weren't, seething to get their arrangements done until at least January or February. So I was like, you know what? Let me try to write something. I haven't done this in a while, so I'm going to sit down. I'm going to try to write something in this meter to kind of see if this working. And that was kind of exactly what started my compositional path. I wrote for my students. And the thing that I love telling about this story is that I only had maybe 13 kids in that band, maybe 14. And in addition to like the part name, flute, clarinet, there was also student names. Like the mallet part was Julia's part. So, I mean, it's very specific. There was no oboe, there was no bassoon, there was no second clarinet. It was the kids that were sitting in front of me, which I think is the premise of our whole conversation today. But that's kind of how I started with it, writing for my students to fill a need. And coincidentally, that was actually the first piece that I had accepted for publication. And it was for the reason that I wrote it, because, hey, this fills a need here pedagogically, but it's also good music. So that's my short story of my first experience in writing this way.
Yeah. How about you, Scott?
Yeah, it's pretty much the same. It's funny because I got my DMA in composition and was writing a lot of chamber music and, concert art music that would be played by really, really fine players in the Philadelphia area, but wasn't getting a whole lot of commissions. And these are friends of mine that were playing my music is what it was. But all the while I'm teaching, right? I went for my DMA while I was full-time band director, high school band director, and then elementary I switched to. So it took me, I'm a very slow learner. It took me until about 15 years into my career that I started writing for my own ensembles. And one of the pieces I wrote was exactly what you said, Mike. I was trying to teach the dotted quarter eighth rhythm. I wrote a piece called Walkin' Cool to do that. Some friends of mine that were band directors asked if they could have it, and I just gave them free music. I was sharing it with other directors, and it got a good response. And that ended up being my first Alfred publication. But I just concur with all of you that nobody knows best the curricular needs of your students, and especially when you add to that things like specific instrumentation of what you're dealing with at the time. Although I do think anything you write that's really good music, even for a very unusual ensemble, if it's good music, it'll work for any ensemble. So a lot of the pieces that I wrote for specific instrumentations in the Parkland School District, I could rework to work just fine for all bands, in a more generic sense.
Yeah, and you brought up a good point. And I didn't realize you had a composition background before teaching as well. But so you probably know, as a composer nowadays, it's really hard to get a performance by a professional ensemble.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're lucky enough, to get those commissions and things like that, a lot of times you can go months or even years between the time you write a piece and you actually get to hear it performed by musicians.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really cool thing about writing for students is I can write a piece and then pass it out the next day and they'll play it and I get that feedback right away to see kind of what's working.
It's a win-win for everybody because you're doing a service for your students. They're doing a service for you because you get to hone your compositional chops. Your district is getting free music. One time I added up how many tens of thousands of dollars of music I've written for the Parkland School District for no recompensation, except for the fact that I was getting better at my craft. So I think it's a win-win-win.
Yeah, for sure.
Like on that whole point, I think part of this whole thing about writing is what inspires you as a writer. I mean, when you go in as a composer first, is there a negative thing of being an educational composer versus a composer? Or, is it the same thing? I think we all wear different hats. It depends on the project, right? If I'm writing for a particular group that's not school-based, is it a different approach than if you're writing for students? I think the thing that I see in well-written music that is born from the classroom is that, and I like to say this about Alfred, but I've believed this for a long time, is finding the balance between art and pedagogy. If it leans one way too much, then there could be trouble, or maybe not. But if it's strictly, I'm only going to use this piece of music to teach, two groups of 2/8 notes, that could be pretty boring. Or I'm going to write a piece, I was joking with somebody before, it's going to be for 42 kazoos and a 72 Fiat. No one's going to ever play that. So finding the balance between art and pedagogy, where it's really, you can use it as a teaching tool, but it's still really got musical grasp to it and is interesting.
I think that's a piece by George Antiel, right?
I did play in a piece by Henry Brandt for 100 trumpets. I think I played piccolo trumpet, and it was a fascinating experience.
Yes.
Right.
Anyway, just to that point of like which hat
Sure.
do you wear at different times, and having students is an amazing way to put on that educator composer hat.
Right.
Yeah. So the next question I had for all of us was sort of what insights about instrument techniques and kind of the capabilities of the different instruments have you gotten from writing for students? And this was something that kind of surprised me, is that, especially because I only work with, you know, 4th, 5th grade beginners, you know, who are very limited in what they can do. But I realized that, you know, for a lot of composers, if you're writing in Finale or Sibelius and the computer is just going to play everything back perfectly, you never really find out what are the things that are idiomatic for each instrument, and where those instruments sound really good, and what are the things that are going to be a real stretch for the players, or maybe more extreme. But for me as a teacher, like if I want to write a B natural over the break for clarinet, like I better really mean it, because I know I'm going to have to spend a lot of time with my students getting them to play that. So that's just kind of one example, but I don't know if you guys have any other things that you've kind of learned about the different sections of the band or instruments that you might not have otherwise, you know, known if you hadn't been writing for your own students.
Well, could I just add an amen to what you said about the accountability? If you're writing for your own students, right, you know you're going to have to make that thing work. Whereas if you're writing generically, you might just overlook how challenging, you know, like, so you'll write, if you're going to use a tricky syncopation, you're going to make sure you use the same syncopation again and again and again, rather than 14 variations of that syncopation, because every time you teach the variation, you've got to break down the rehearsal and waste a lot of time. So I think that's, like a parent, say somebody who doesn't have kids writing a book on parenting, right? That's kind of what would be like writing for players that you're not going to have to actually produce that music. So amen to that.
And it's a great point, Scott. And that variation on syncopation, I've made that mistake myself. I've had somebody say to me, like, why did you write 3 measures of the same and you changed it that 4th time? Like, oops, sorry about that. Yeah. But when it comes to like what kinds of limitations have I learned from students, I think about the best thing about writing for students is they're honest. At least if your rapport with students was like mine, they have no problem telling you when something just doesn't work or when it's really good. But like things like if you're constantly going B flat to C natural on trombone and you do it at a fast tempo, I mean, thinking about, those physical limitations like that, or the idea that people need to breathe once in a while, not everything is staggered breathing, or they can't play for 47 measures without a breath, having space, and kids, you can tell by the purple in their face that they need breaks. So things like that, the things you don't necessarily learn from an orchestration book. And I had a great college professor that taught me something that stuck with me, and it still does, about learning the instruments and what their limitations are, and has nothing to do with the computer or anything else. He said, play every part on your primary instrument. So as a trumpet player, that's something I did throughout my teaching career. Go over and play the alto sax part on my trumpet. Go play the trombone part. Go play the flute part, play the clarinet part. Not only do you get really good at transposing, but you also get to live in their parts. I don't know if this is true for you guys, but sometimes when I look at a score, I miss a lot of things that I find when I look at a single part. And that could be in proofreading and other things. Like, how did I miss this? And you see it all on a part. And I feel that way about compositionally and breaking it down when working with students on music. I'm only focused on their part, and I see what's characteristic for them, and I kind of see where their struggles lie. And playing it on my own instrument, I also felt some of those struggles, so I think those are the limitations. Physical limitations, like a 4th grader playing C naturals all the time. And then also just knowing where kids need breaks. Those are a couple of the biggies that jumped out to me.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point though about playing the parts, because a lot of times, I'll write a piece and I'll feel like, okay, this sounds pretty good in Finale. And then we get to our lessons, and I'm like playing these parts with the kids. I'm like, oh, that does not work. One of
the most disingenuous things with the computer is balance and blend. I've learned, melody. Make sure that the melody is appropriately doubled so that it can be heard. The reality is on the computer, everything sounds the same volume. So, maybe a flute part and everybody else playing some accompaniment part, you might not hear that flute part, enough. So that being amongst students, really, you learn a lot about balance too.
Yeah.
I'd also add that on the positive side, one of you mentioned about kids will tell you if they don't like something, and they'll also respond if they do like something. So I often, with my younger bands, would accompany functionally, just make up accompaniments, little silly, accompaniments while they're playing something from either our lesson book or maybe just some songs that I'd written out just the melody to, but I'm just improvising the accompaniment. And believe it or not, if they respond well to it, that might become a piece. And that's certainly true with I wrote a piece called Appalachian Hoedown that has a couple fiddle tunes, and that was just me vamping, and the kids seemed to like what I did. At the Feast of Stephen is a piece that I actually played in the band room as just like a little accompaniment before it became a piece. So if they respond positively to it, I figure, hey, maybe other people will like it as well.
Because like kind of getting experience with what balance is in an ensemble. One thing I found also is just kind of understanding how the different ranges of the instrument play, because it's like you said, it's one thing to read in an arranging book, like, okay, the range of the saxophone is from here to here, but then it's another thing to kind of hear, like, well, how does this note really sound? And I know as a trombone player, like I can remember playing pieces by like well-known brass composers who've just written things that are like, okay, I can play those notes, but that's not really where the trombone sounds good. And so like just kind of learning, what are kind of the idiomatic ranges and what kind of effects you get with different instruments, I think.
Yeah, I think it was Robert Sheldon who told me that he thought his the best orchestration class he ever took was being a band director, right? Being on the podium, looking at scores, just seeing what works and what doesn't work.
How about percussion? I don't know if I don't think either of you guys are percussionists. But as a brass player, like that has been a whole new world for me. And even just like learning, well, what is every way you can hit? You can use a crash cymbal, and what do these mallets sound like? And getting a kid to do those things. I don't know if you guys have had any particular experiences with percussionists.
Well, I'll look at Scott. You want to go first?
No, you go ahead.
So I was lucky. Again, I go back to everything is experience and mentors and people that we're surrounded with. I didn't realize how good I had it with the percussionists I was surrounded with in life. I had a marching band, drum corps growing up kind of thing. I was in drum corps during high school. And as my college methods class was excellent, and my percussion training I thought was really good. And I thought that everybody had this. And I was ultimately asked by Dave Black, hey, Chris, Alfred has, we have a band method, we have string methods, we have guitar methods, piano methods. Any reason you could think of we don't have a percussion method? My answer was no, Dave, I don't know why there's not a percussion method. And he said, do you want to write one with me? And my answer was, yes, Dave, I would love to write one with you. So I actually did write with Sound Percussion, a method book for percussion and concert instruments. And I realized at that point that there's a lot of information I took for granted about how rolls work and about how to create sounds on various percussion, how to notate various percussion instruments and techniques. And putting that book together really was pulling a lot of resources together. So absolutely learned a ton about writing for percussion and also just communicating clearly with percussionists, making sure that the music I was writing was percussionist friendly. Can they actually do it? You've got one piece I'm editing now. It's like you have 1.2 seconds to put down a tambourine and run over to the hi-hat. It's not possible. There's a lot of music, and I've done it too. Everything I tell you that is a mistake or I would consider a mistake, I've done it 10 times. We just put a list of percussion instruments and then just say, well, let's figure it out back there. As opposed to really thinking, how can kids actually do this? Is it playable? And I think that's probably the biggest thing I've learned from writing for students, making parts that are achievable and that they can physically get to and that we're able to, and that they can read. Actually, my percussion students read music too. So it's like making sure that they do it and don't run away from just the mallet parts, making sure that their parts. My wife taught me this and she teaches me a lot of things. the kids in percussion, they didn't sign up to be in band just to be busy or to be just to warm up while everybody else is doing stuff. They're there for everything else in there too. So as a writer, I would always think, is this going to keep those kids actively engaged, not just busy? Are they going to enjoy their parts and they're going to learn from it? To me, that's a teacher thing. So that's a composer-teacher balance act. But that's my thoughts on percussion.
Yeah, I would say for all instruments, including percussion, I really enjoy playing them and playing the parts that I write for students, and up to a certain level, say in intermediate bands, I can play all the instruments well enough to play the parts. But I love getting a pair of sticks in my hands or experimenting with cymbals or things like that. And I do have some great percussionist friends. And plus, I just think going out and seeing, like last time I went to see the Philadelphia Orchestra, I heard the percussionists doing things that I thought, I got to use that in a piece, So just when you're listening all the time, you're always getting ideas. But especially for younger band, I definitely want to make sure those things are playable. So I play them myself. And I always think about, like in the Parkin School District where I taught, we had a district-wide fifth grade band with like 230 kids in it, 26 percussionists. You can't write just snare, bass, and cymbals. With that many percussionists, it would be just assaulting to have like 23 snares, a bass drum, and a cymbal. So I like to think
that cabinet that they can use. Right?
So I often write auxiliary percussion that really add nice color but aren't essential, so that a band that's smaller might not choose to use it, but a band that's larger would have lots of options for diffusing the sound of many snares.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I want to move on to my next question. And Scott, you touched on this a little bit. Is just sort of how the process of composing for students maybe is a little different, or how the act of composing for students forces you to do things a little differently. And you gave the example of the syncopated rhythm, or maybe it was Chris. Mm-hmm. And I had that exact experience of, I was working with a middle school jazz band, and I had written this piece, and these rhythms I thought were really, really hip, and every measure was something different. But then during our rehearsals, it's like every week I got to take 5 minutes and be like, okay, let's count this. Okay, remember we did this last time, and then the drummer's getting in trouble, and eventually I was like, oh, no, I'm just going to redo it, and I'm just going to use one rhythm. I'm going to do variations on this one rhythm, and then of course, like, they pick it up a lot quicker. But it also really surprised me that I liked the piece better, because now it was so much more coherent. Rather than having all these different ideas, it was kind of just based around the one, and that's something I really took to heart. Is when I was a younger, but I think a lot of people, and myself included, when you're getting started, you try to put everything into a piece, all the different ideas. And now I try to think of like one or two melodic or rhythmic, simple motifs that I can kind of develop and use over and over in different ways. And of course, we know that, we all talk about Beethoven, doing that, all the great composers. But for me, like, I wouldn't have had that insight if I hadn't been having to teach to these students. So I don't know if you guys have any other examples of way that knowing you have to teach something and changes what you would write.
Well, first of all, I definitely agree with what you said about trying to put every single thing into a piece. And I looked real briefly at the questions that people are writing in. And one person asked if we have ever taught students to compose. And I have, I taught high school music theory, things like that. And now I'm at a university level and I'm teaching composition. So I'm always thinking about, how do I do it? Or how do other composers that do it well do it? Like, what is it about Beethoven or Mozart or Copland or whoever that makes their music of lasting worth? And one of those things you just mentioned, it's economy. It's not having too many different ideas, but having one or two main ideas and then developing those things. So I think when we're working with students to do what we do, we're sort of analyzing our own music and trying to figure out what worked well for us. But that's certainly one thing, is economy, and not I would say another thing would be revision. Like the fact that we write for our own students and get to hear them play like a first draft of a piece. And then we realize, oh, that worked or that didn't work. So then we get to do a second, a third, a fourth, a fifth, a sixth, a seventh, and eighth revision. And by the time you get to 7 or 8 revisions, you've got a darn good tight piece. And I never send Chris over there, my editor at Alfred, I never send him a first draft. And even when I send him an 8th draft, he sends back 20 problems that he found right away. So, I mean, I really go for trying to really send refined, revised music that's like at a higher level, not that starting level. And I do the same thing with the student composers that I work with. I always encourage them, in the professional world, you don't send in a first or second draft.
If I whittle down some of the things that I've learned from working with students from a compositional process standpoint, I think one of the biggest things that, I mean, we can think about everything: harmony, notes that work, voicings that work or don't work, and all that kind of stuff. But if I were to pick a thing, it would be pacing. I think when having students in front of me, you can feel the tension when something's too long, or when something just doesn't sit right, or the ending doesn't quite gel. So pacing from the student perspective of, you know, the twist when you need a twist in the music, or maybe elongating something when it needs that extra tension. So to me, that you don't get, again, from a computer, and you don't get that from just writing and handing it off to somebody. You get that from being in the room with the bodies, because you're actually feeling that engagement with students and the music. And then you go back, and the first thing that you have to do is leave your ego and what you think at the door or at your desk, and be willing to say, well, you know what? That part isn't hard on paper, but in reality, it's really hard, and I need to change it. So I think that's part of the thing too, is to not be stubborn. And I think as a teacher, you balance that composer brain of like, no, this is the way that I want it, and there's nothing wrong with this on the paper here, so you should be able to play it, versus this isn't working, so I need to rethink this. And I think that live interaction with students helps a lot with that. So pacing, I think, would be a big thing you get from that scenario.
I think connected to pacing is the proportions of a piece too. And a good example of that would be like if you had say you had a 6-minute introduction and then a 1-minute get to the meat of the piece, right? That's like a horrible proportions. So just standing back and looking at the shape of a piece. Chris, have you ever heard my piece Magic Valley?
Sure.
It's 6 minutes long, but when I submitted it to Bob, it was 11 minutes long. And that's a perfect example of him saying, I like the idea of it, but if you could cut this down to about 6 minutes, we'll take it. You know?
Yeah.
So,
yep. That's a great piece.
I've learned lessons the hard way.
You know, you made me just think of something else that I think would be valuable for people that do write for your own ensembles, is the balance of instrument difficulty. In other words, you don't want to have a wicked hard clarinet part because your clarinet player is really an amazing player, and then have a super simple trumpet part. You want to try to look at equity in the difficulty levels of the instrument. So I've had to tweak that over the years too, because Julia's mallet part might have been a little harder than the one that I submitted. Because we're writing for our specific groups, and certain kids have certain restrictions. So it might be like a grade half clarinet part, but a grade 2 flute part. So that's something that I think on both sides of the coin, if you're thinking about writing music for your students, do it for those reasons. If you're thinking about taking that music and then redoing it for a wider audience, you might have to base your revisions on a more global scale. So you just made me think about that with pacing and, you know.
Well, we're really getting into some nuts and bolts. And Mike, you might, I don't want to, I got one more thing I want to say real quick, and then I'll turn it back. But, you know, on the other end, like if you're writing easy parts, I've seen so many young composers, both band director friends of mine who are sharing their music with me because they know that, you know, I sort of do it already or whatever, or students, but they'll have accompaniment parts that are just whole note, whole note, whole note, whole note, whole note. And so the line I use with all of them is I say, you know, parts that are more interesting to play are always more interesting to listen to. And so even though your general idea of wanting to have that chordal accompaniment, that's fine, but make it, you know, tie it over the bar to a quarter note and put a rest in, do something so that the player has something to sink their teeth into, even in a very easy part.
I was going to say the exact same thing, is that like kids will get real bored if you just give them those quarter notes, you know, in a way. And if we've all played in orchestras, and you know that, like, yeah, sometimes we do have to do that kind of boring stuff, but creating an interesting part for each instrument keeps the kids and the students engaged, but also like makes the piece a lot more interesting too. And also kind of mixing up the texture. So in a concert band, a lot of times it's just, okay, the flutes and trumpets are playing the melody, and the trombones and tubas are doing the bass line, and the horns and saxophones are doing something in the middle, who knows, and that's kind of what everything sounds like. But after a while, that gets a little boring. But all of a sudden, if you have like a melodic thing in the tuba and the low woodwinds, and like that changes up the texture and it makes the piece a lot more interesting. So I think that's a good point. You were also talking about doing revising. Have you guys given students sort of like incomplete pieces before and saying like, hey, I wrote this first part of this piece and let's play it and see how it's going and then come back to it? Because that's definitely something I've done. I've also given students pieces where I don't have a title yet and been like, what do you think this is about? Like, what should the title be? And I've gotten some very creative ideas from that.
I haven't done it that way. Usually when I hand out a piece to students, it's like my second or third draft, and I know I'm going to be revising it, but I haven't ever tried handing out a piece in progress. That's which I think is a cool idea, but I haven't done that.
Yeah, I have been accused by some as being a bit of a workaholic. So when I don't know how you guys work, but when I actually start doing the writing thing, after that terror and fear of being, that critical self-doubt, I have no good ideas, I'm not good at this anyway. Once you actually start writing and you like get into a zone of it, I tend to just keep on writing. So I don't really pause very much. But like Scott said, like once it's done, it's never really done. It's like that sculpting thing. I've now got this thing, and then I'm going to give it to the kids and we're going to play it. And then I'm going to take a while to sculpt it. And then, I play for my family and then I sculpt it all over again. But I think it's more, for me, I don't really process in chunks, so to speak. I usually wind up going into it and then kind of continuing until I'm finished and then going back and, adding, removing, tweaking, changing.
Yeah. Well, I've definitely had pieces, I've played a bunch of times over like the past 10 years that, every time I've maybe played it 5 times, and each time it's like a different version. So you can see all the different save files I have for each year we do it. So the last kind of area I wanted to talk about, and then we'll get to some of these questions we have in the chat, was just what have you learned from students about what makes an engaging piece of music? We already talked a little bit about making sure each of the individual parts is engaging, but what, because students aren't shy about saying like, oh, I love this piece, is super fun, or like, oh, we got to play that one again, groan. What kind of things have you learned about that they respond to as your like first audience for your compositions?
Well, that the idea that parts that are more interesting to play or more interesting to listen to, that's something I think I've figured out, that when kids like the part that I handed them. Another thing would be that thing about proportion. I tend to just have really long musical ideas, and I tend to go for like 11-minute pieces in my first outing. So I've learned from my own students who can get fatigued by like, you don't write a grade 1 piece that's 6 minutes long, even though in my mind I think it can go that long, and you don't give like a 40 measure drum solo in a grade 1 piece. There's all sorts of proportional things you have to just discipline yourself. So the saying I use when I'm working with students is leave the listeners wanting more, not having had enough, right? So that would be, say, something that I've learned from that experience. And I've just noticed that students respond really well to pieces that have an interesting start. So beginnings are very important. Endings are, so beginnings kind of make the listener want to listen to the piece and make the students want to play the piece. And endings make people glad they listened to the piece, or students feel good about, getting an applause as a reaction. So I always think beginnings and endings have to be special. And then somewhere around 3/4 of the way through a piece, or 2/3 through the piece, I want to put a climax in, something, a high point. Those are kind of proportional things that I think about, that I've noticed that kids respond well to them.
Those are really good points. If your kids are anything like mine, they only like fast pieces. Mm-hmm. But the other part of that too, I would caution people against, kids that groan about the piece that they don't like, because very, very often, my experience, the piece that they say they don't like, they wind up loving. And they don't like it because they don't understand why they don't like it, because it's either challenging, or they haven't connected with it emotionally yet if it's a lyrical piece. So I always weighed the kids groaning versus, are you just being like, because it's not a fast one, or is there really something to groan about? So that's kind of something that I think I've learned from students when they react one way or another.
And that's because you're a good teacher. You make them like it.
That's right. Well, because I don't think any of us would give students music that we don't think has value. Mm-hmm. So, and I do think that teachers know more than students. As much as I loved students, I do think that we know more than them. And sometimes we know things that they have. This is good for you. These are your vitamins. Take your vitamins. You don't have to know why. Just take your vitamins. It's good for you. You'll see. And just like, with your own parents, I'm never going to be like my parents. And you grow up and like, damn it, my parents were right. That's the kind of thing. They will eventually come around. And then once in a while you pick a stinker, but that's the way it is too. But as a writing standpoint, I find that kids, exactly what Scott said, they love fast, engaging intros and endings, but they also do like slower music when it's emotionally something that they can grasp onto. So,
yeah. I think for me, the sign to my mind that I've written something good is if I hear a kid walking down the hallway and they're like humming the melody, like, because it's like, okay, this is like memorable enough, but it's also kind of like, it's like they're getting extra practice when they're not even in my classes. They're kind of mentally practicing this thing. And I think, especially for the younger kids, really having a melody that you can grab onto is super important. And I actually usually, with the pieces I play, I just have the whole band just practice playing the melody before we learn that, like concert music. So even if like my trombone players aren't actually going to perform the melody in the piece, well, they're still getting to know that. And I find that, like, yeah, with a lot of beginning band pieces don't have. I'm kind of surprised they like don't have that. Like, I listen to the piece and there's like some exciting moments and things, but if you ask me like, well, what is the melody to this, like I don't think I could sing it. So that's one that I always that's kind of where I always try to start from, is a compelling melody. I think the kind of related to this, I think in the like publishing world, we have to respond to what sells. And a lot of times that is pieces that have a hook. You mentioned your kazoo piece, Chris, but things like that, or things that have a catchy title, or of course there's pop music and things like that. But I think the reality is that kids will buy into, like you were saying, things that just have musical value once they kind of experience that. So I don't know if you guys have any other thoughts about that. Well, I'll give one example. Like so one of my favorite pieces from like college band is this Bach Passacaglia in C minor Huntsberger arrangement, which I really like. But so I like just wrote a Baroque a grade 1 like Passacaglia, like just straight up like Baroque music, and the kids like really liked it. Because it just had like a certain sound to it. So I don't know, you guys have any other examples or thoughts on that?
I would want to respond to you mentioned some commercial considerations of published music. And while that's true, I know before I was published, I used to think that in a very stereotypical general way, like, oh, published music is all this one size fits all kind of thing. But now from the other side, being somebody who has been published, every composer I know that writes for publishers like Alfred, we don't turn in pieces unless we are really passionate about it. I don't send something in unless I really believe it's like the next great thing. And I'm continually surprised that not everybody is always as excited about my music as I am, but because I'll send in a piece that I thought was like a slam dunk home run and it sells okay. And I'm happy that Alfred will take a chance on the next piece. But, I don't send in anything that's just trying to check a box or whatever. So I just think that might be a stereotype that's very easy to make if you're not published yet. But On the other hand, Jack Stamp, who's another Pennsylvania composer, one time we were talking and he was saying that the biggest hurdle that he finds with people getting their music out there is that it's just hard work. It is hard work to finish pieces, and details matter. You can't have, missing. So all the kind of hard work and drudgery that's behind the scenes actually does prevent some people from, moving to the next step. So
yeah, it's not all glory. And my wife reminds me, or she reminded me a lot more often in the past, is like, listen, you didn't start writing music to get published. You started writing music
right.
because you were teaching kids. So I think as long as you stay grounded in your, whatever your motives are, it'll come through your music. And I think it's pretty apparent if you just write a piece because you're trying to get it published, that you can hear that, you're trying to check boxes. It doesn't sound inspired. It sounds like a lot of other things. And I think that when you write something that you do believe in, you do hear that in the writing. And it is one of those introspective, reflective types of things that we, and I sit here and I do this myself. Listen, I'm not in the classroom anymore. It's weird for me to not have a band at my disposal every day. After 2019, it's honor bands. And one of the most recent honor bands I did was in Pennsylvania. It was like a 5th and 6th grade honor band, which is kind of cool. But yeah, let me tell you, it was great working with those 5th and 6th graders, because for me, it was a great thing in my brain to remind me of what it's like, what these kids' limitations are like, and to still have that connection with kids. So that you better believe that the next grade 1 or grade half that I write has those kids in mind and all that kind of thing. So trying to be inspired for the right reasons and being grounded in that, coming from whatever your beliefs are, I think comes through your music.
I think regardless of your aspirations, your own students love when you write for them. And you mentioned that, Mike, that your kids were really happy that you wrote that. And I know that I would always write at least one piece a year for my students, but there was times where I just wanted to put some other music in front of them that wasn't mine, and they would moan like, "Oh, you mean you don't care about us enough to write a piece this year?" Like it became like it backfired on me. So I just know, even whether or not you have aspirations about publication, it's a winner to write for your students, and I think everybody should try it. Kids will respond positively.
Yeah. I mean, I would say I kind of downplay the fact that I'm giving them pieces I've written. And it's interesting because then I can get a little more honest feedback too, if they don't, it's me. But sometimes they'll like look up and see my name on the page and they're like, wait, did you write this? I was like, okay. But I totally agree with you, Chris, is that the first reason I'm not writing pieces to get published, I'm writing for my students to teach them, and sort of like, if it so happens that this does get published, that's great. Most of the things I write don't, and that's fine too. Yeah, I thought we've got about 15 or so minutes left and a bunch of questions in the Q&A. So if anyone else has more questions, please type them in, but I thought we could move on to some of those. So I'll start with Clifford Hall asks, due to market forces, it seems that most major music publishers are very cautious when publishing pieces of unpublished composers. What real-world advice can you give to jumping over this very tall wall to get your music published by a major publisher? And Chris, as the here for Alfred Publications, why don't you talk about how does something get your attention if it's not from a
So it is challenging, and it's not because there's a lack of amazing writers in the world. The biggest problem or challenge is space. We can only produce a finite number of titles per year, and when you fill those spots with your well-known composers and that kind of stuff, and all that kind of stuff, there are very few opportunities that are there. There are opportunities, and that's really important. So even with all of your best-selling writers writing, there are opportunities. I think that's really important. You have to just keep trying. You have to keep trying, because here's the thing that happens when you're putting a catalog together. Let's say there's going to be 25 new pieces. Well, they can't all be 160 beats per minute entitled, Dragon Runs. Oh, wait, I wrote one called Dragon Run. I don't know, some other title, you know what I mean? So they can't all be like a fast piece, or they can't all be a slow piece. So you have to balance that geography of what it's going to be. We have to have some holiday music, some fast, some slow, some deeply melodic, some experimental. It's all that kind of stuff gets in there. When you put all that into the hopper and there's a couple of slots available, it's very, very competitive. So I think the biggest thing that you have to do is just to kind of keep trying. And we live in a really good time where we have a lot of electronic resources at our fingertips. Our submission page has a lot of information. If you go to alfred.com/music-submissions, you'll find a lot of information there, PDFs with grade level guides. I recently wrote a blog called Mission Submission. I would definitely seek that. Maybe Heather can put that in the links or put that in the chat so people can find that. We recently did a whole webinar about, trying to have a successful submission. And I actually started to make a list of like, well, what makes a poor response and a rejection? I hate to use the word rejection, but what makes a rejection? That was way too negative for me. So I turned that around to, what kind of questions should you ask yourself before submitting a piece of music? And I've gotten some response from people saying like, oh, I wish I had this 15 years ago. And it's just, that might be helpful. So look that up, Mission Submission blog, and just stick with it. All the stuff we talked about today, if you can put all this into a piece of music, it's a winner. Writing for your students, getting the pacing right, getting the balance right from a difficulty standpoint, from a musical standpoint, writing it from an impassioned place with engaging parts for all. I mean, those are things that are really important. But I have to be honest, because of that space limitation, we have to say no to some really good pieces. So I always try to encourage people to say, if it doesn't fit for us, it doesn't mean it's not a good piece. Send it someplace else because it might be perfect for some other publisher. I do think that all ships rise with the tide. And when our company does well and other companies do well, our industry does well and our teachers do well, if it's not the right fit for us, just go down the list. I had a list this long of publishers. So when I was going to get my rejection letters, I was just going to kind of keep going and then keep going and see what happens. But
go ahead, Mike. Okay. All right. So two things that come to mind would be just get your music performed. Work on that, because if people are performing your music, I think eventually you're going to get published. And that was true with that first piece that I mentioned that I got published at Alfred many moons ago called Walkin' Cool. About a dozen band director friends of mine had also done it and told me, man, my kids love this piece, like that kind of thing. So the second thing I would say, so I think it's really important, work on getting your music performed, not just electronically by Finale, but actually getting performed. And then the second thing would be that a lot of this is relational. I can't tell you how many years Robert Sheldon encouraged me to go to Midwest before I finally actually did go to Midwest. And then when you finally go, you meet people, you network and all that kind of stuff, and it opens up opportunities. The year that Walkin' Cool got published was the same. It was the year after John O'Reilly came to, as a coordinator, I had him come to my school district to do an in-service with our K-12 instrumental staff. And we went out to lunch and he said, oh, you're a composer, send me something. So, I mean, just that relational thing. If you're meeting people in the music world and networking, it helps over not meeting people and not making those connections.
I was going to say exactly the same thing. As I had the same experience of, I live in Chicago, so I'm always at Midwest. And just every year I'm just going there and I'm trying to meet, so Chris and Brian Balmages, and I met Bob Sheldon and people with other publishers, and they're all very nice. And like, it never hurts to just go introduce yourself and put a face with the name. And so when you do submit something, they kind of have that connection. The other thing I'll say is that it's actually never been easier to put music out there without having a publisher. You can go to the J.W. Pepper MyScore, and you can just upload your music and they will put it on J.W. Pepper and sell it and print it and take care of all of the business stuff. And, that's incredible. So there's a lot of people doing that, a lot of people selling through their own websites. So there's a lot of opportunities. Okay, we touched on this question a little bit, but maybe we can answer it more in depth. Joseph Mish asks, how many of you have helped your students compose a piece for their ensemble or worked with their ideas to create a piece? So I'll share an example. I actually had a colleague, if you're watching, hi Cindy, who a few years ago had an assignment for her students where they were writing, just kind of 8-measure melodies, just for a solo instrument. And then I took, a couple of those melodies and then just worked them into like a full ensemble piece. And that was, I think, a really cool thing for those students to get to hear their melodies performed. Have you guys done anything like that?
I haven't used student melodies, but I've had student composers before. And I don't know how you guys feel about composition classes and things like that, but it's very much coaching. You're just fine. You can teach them orchestration limitations and rhythms and all that stuff, but you can't teach inspiration, that X factor that, you could tell, what typical melody lines do and all that kind of stuff. But it's really coaching students and having them find their voice with that kind of a thing. So I've definitely had students do that to varying degrees of success. It's always interesting to see them explore their own musical thoughts.
Yeah, there's a project that I would do every year. And then, how the school year has gotten more crowded and more crowded as more programs that are not music take away contact time. So we ended up moving it to our summer camp. It became an activity we would do in our summer camp, but it's called the pedal point duet, where I'd have kids write a duet for their instrument. So if you play clarinet, it has to be for 2 clarinets. If you play alto sax, it's for 2 alto saxes. And the bottom part has to be the pedal point that doesn't change notes. It can have all sorts of different rhythmic things, but it doesn't change notes. And the top part just explores a melodic contour. No matter how uninspired you are, you just can't write a bad pedal point duet, because pedal point is just one of the most wonderful compositional devices ever given to man. So we would always pick a couple of those and have them performed in a concert. So that's one example of a composition project I've done with students. And by the way, I've done that project, that pedal point duet, with elementary, middle school, high school, and university students, and it works really well no matter what level it is.
That's fun. Okay, next one from Yacinda Wilson asks, what do you do if you get writer's block? Like if you have an idea that's not fully fleshed out in your head and you get some out, but you aren't sure where you want to go after that. I definitely get that, so I want to hear what you guys do.
Well, my thing is to just enjoy life and art, especially. So I'll go for walks, or I'll just forget about the deadline or the piece and read a good book and just get inspired by some other kind of art that's not music. We had a composer, but a songwriter, not a concert art music, but somebody who writes songs, a songwriter, come to Cairn University where I teach. And the last thing he said, it was a Q&A with students. The students asked him what's a good compositional tip you can give us. And he said, well, you basically write from whatever's inside you. And if all you're doing is binge watching Netflix all day, that's all you're going to write is Netflix music. So you got to get some high quality art in your brain. And not that there aren't great things on Netflix, but I guess what he was saying is, put good stuff in, really edifying stuff that's going to really inspire you, and then it'll eventually come out.
For me, with writer's block, I have to just walk away from it and try not to worry too much, and just have faith that something's going to happen. And I'm not, maybe I don't read as much as Scott. Maybe I should, but I do find
I read comic books, but
yeah, I just find that distancing myself from it and trying not to get too personally, worried, anxious that it's not going to happen, having faith that it's going to happen, it'll be okay. And then actually just sitting down and hitting a couple of notes on the keyboard. I've actually found that sometimes the keyboard is overwhelming. There's too many notes, going back to that restrictive kind of a thing where sometimes it's too much. I'm from Jersey. So when you go to a diner here in Jersey, you've got pages and pages. Sometimes you can't pick anything off the menu because I just ordered the same exact thing that I always order because there's just too much. So sometimes what I'll do, if keyboard is too much for me to think through, I'll pick up my trumpet, because it's a single line instrument and it restricts me from thinking about all the other stuff. And once you get a couple of things happening, I'm pushing valves. Once you get a couple of things happening, it tends to open the door again. So sometimes going from too many choices and narrowing that focus can break you from that a little bit.
Interesting. Scott, you were talking about putting good stuff in, and that just makes me think like, oh, well, this is why I keep writing things that sound like they're from video games. Get it home.
There's
so
some
like,
great music on video games these days, though, man.
the piece that Alfred just published of mine this year, Funky Penguins, like that's the bass line from a Mega Man 2 stage. And then my kids just performed this piece, and then a bunch of them are like, oh, that sounds like The Legend of Zelda. And I was like, oh yeah, I guess that's where I got that from. But yeah, I definitely think like being able to just put something down and come back to it. I have a whole folder of like half-written things that I will occasionally come back to and then listen to, and then fresh ears get like a totally new idea or figure out where it goes.
I'm looking right now at a stack of, these are all sketchbooks that I keep on a shelf here. There's hundreds of ideas that will probably never find their way to a piece. And my favorite quote with that is a guy named Linus Pauling said, the best way to have a great idea is to have a lot of ideas. So, I mean, you just write down anything, maybe a week later you think, oh, that's crap. And probably 90% of what it's in those sketchbooks is crap, but 10% or whatever, 1% might be a good piece.
Nice. All right. I think we have time for just a couple more. Bahar Hediet, I'm sorry if I'm saying that name wrong, asks, how do you create a slower piece while still making sure it's not boring and repetitive rhythm-wise? And Chris, you were talking about how kids can sometimes respond to those smaller pieces. What do you find helps with that?
I just love working with, that's one of my favorite challenges, is writing something lyrical but making sure that there's movement. And I guess I learned this a lot from Bob, actually, when I had to revise a whole section of one of my pieces, and I just learned so much from it. You can have a lyrical piece at a slow tempo, but movement within the lines. So having some kind of motion within the lines, it doesn't have to be like crazy leaps or anything. It can be harmonic textures that just grow and change. And as long as the pacing of that tension and release is there, it doesn't get boring. So I do think having some rhythmic motion, because I think if we think lyrical, it's all whole notes and half notes. I don't think that's true at all. I mean, a piece can be lyrical and have eighth notes and 16th notes. It can have flow. It's the style. So just making sure that there's motion and having that balance between tension and release, having those high points and low points, keep it from getting stagnant. And sometimes a harmonic shift. I've done this, like, can you change the chord there? It's a little predictable. And it's right. Darn it, you're right. Let me try to be unpredictable. But it's where it should have gone. So sometimes like getting that outside opinion too, like, and doing something unexpected.
Now, this session could have been renamed Lessons We Learned from Bob, because those are exactly the same two things I was going to say, Chris. Because he would tell me, look, I have three parts, a bass line, an inner voice, and a melodic voice. Make sure they're all interesting, and make sure there's a nice harmonic surprise. And like those are two things that, great stuff.
It really is.
And I think one thing I would add, that just because this piece is slow doesn't mean everything has to be legato. Like there can be some variety in the texture. If you have some short notes to kind of define some of those rhythms, like I think just having more of those contrasts, I think, can keep it interesting, so that so it's not just all the like long sustained legato whole note. You hear some of those things in there too. All right, last one in 2 minutes. This is the same person. Okay, here's one from Joshua. What is your advice for editing a piece when you think the piece is done or has gone through 4 to 5 edits? Or I would say, when do you stop? Because I could edit something forever. When are you done?
Whenever I am done, I always put it away for at least a week. Don't even look at it. Come back, and I find 11 more things to revise. So put some space between when you think it's done and when you're going to send it on.
That's really, really good advice. And I find the same thing, Scott. I find the same thing when I feel like, okay, this one's done, and I go away from it and just let it marinate somewhere else. When I come back to it, I hear things that I didn't hear before. So it might be an edit in terms of a section or chords or whatever, or it could be, I've got an accent here and I missed one here, and I've got a forte crescendoing to a forte. It could even be those types of things. but giving yourself a little bit of space is a great way to do it. Or number two, send it to a trusted colleague or friend that'll look at it for you. I mean, there's still a lot of value in the network of your colleagues. Hey, can you take a look at this for me? I'm usually too close to it. I wrote a piece last year. I had accents on almost every note. I sent it to somebody that said, I can't decide which ones to get rid of. Can you do this for me? Just delete anything that shouldn't be accented. So sometimes we're too close to see it. So a trusted colleague and friend, peer is the way to go.
Yeah. And it's even like non-musicians, just because I think, especially when you're working on something a long time, it's hard to get out of your own head, and just getting feedback from everybody.
Fresh ears.
Is that a good place to wrap up then?
Great. I think this is a perfect place to stop. So we get to all the questions. We got to most of them, so that's great. Thank you to Mike and Chris and Scott, and thank you all for joining us today. Have a great day. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks. Chris, Scott, thank you guys.
You got it. Bye-bye.